Now, joining us from MIT Sloan in Boston is Roberto Rigobon, professor of management and of applied economics. Roberto is famous for his sense of humor and for being a great inspiration to his students, and infamous for being obsessed with measurements. He has worked on many projects, such as the Aggregate Confusion Project with the Sloan Sustainability Initiative. And today he will challenge us with his thinking on how we measure things or not measure things, and what the impact is on our well-being. So Roberto, so good to see you again and to have you with us. Thank you so much. And no doubt I am not doing your research or passion for measurements any justice here. So let me go silent and hand it right over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. And I love to be remembered by my sense of humor, not by the content of my talk. So thank you so much for that. And welcome everybody to this great conference. I hope that you have had a wonderful 3 days and very productive. Today I want to talk about measurement, and I understand that if I tell you that measurement is just going out and measuring things like what a statistical office does, you will say that it has to be the most boring topic in the history of humankind. And what I want to do is to show you two things. One, that is actually incredibly exciting, and second is that indeed is incredibly necessary. So first, let me tell you a little bit of a framework that I use at MIT to understand social well-being. So I always say, like, how can I tell if a community, a city, a state, a country, a region is actually happy, or is in some sense kind of sustainable, and sustainable from a very broad perspective, not only from the environment. So I use a framework that I call PROMISE, where the P stands for personal aspects, R for relationships, O for organizations, jobs, and culture, M for the markets and the economy, I for institutions, S for social, and E for the environment. And the social part includes politics. So in that world of PROMISE, when you think about it, society will be sustainable if you actually are sustainable in all of these dimensions. I mean, if you have a country where they are taking care of the environment, the social and the political aspects are fine, the economy is thriving, the institutions are respected, but people are super unhappy, that doesn't look very sustainable to me. On the contrary, if you have a country where people are super happy, but the economy is a disaster, the political system is a disaster, they're destroying the environment, well, that reminds me of my countries in Latin America. That doesn't seem very sustainable either. So you need to have a balance across all of these dimensions. And what is unfortunate is that we have a tremendous degree of ignorance about how well we are doing in any of these dimensions. Truly, we pay a lot of attention to the M, which is markets and the economy. We measure that very well. We have invested hundreds of years, literally hundreds of years of effort to measure our economic outcomes better. So we create standards on finance, standards in accounting, standards on disclosure. We have statistical offices that work really, really hard on producing statistics that are meaningful. And those are almost all of them about how the economy is doing. So it's all about the M. We invest very little in the other dimensions. And that's why I think that measurement is a first order degree issue, is that we need to pay attention to all the other dimensions. Otherwise, how can you tell if you're doing it correctly? So we actually don't. So we don't measure happiness or sadness, for that matter. We measure only suicides and cases of depression. We don't measure the quality of a relationship between two individuals. We don't do that. We mostly count how many times you break those relationships. So either in marriages or in business. We don't measure how much are we destroying the environment. We mostly wait until we lose the lake to realize that the lake was being polluted. We certainly don't measure social happiness or social unrest. We wait until the unrest is so dramatic that is reflected by people rioting or protesting in the streets. We don't measure the quality of a political system. We wait until we have two idiots as the possible candidates, and then we regret the whole process. So I'm giving you examples of things that have happened in all our life that we measure incredibly late extreme events. So in fact, let me explain a little bit what are the four aspects of the bad measurement that we do. But I hope that you realize that how on earth can I make good decisions if I have to wait for the tragedy to take place for me to decide? I mean, in fact, I actually believe that the world is actually making the choices that way. We wait until a tragedy takes place and we realize that the tragedy has taken place, and now we react. Well, that sounds like you're acting exactly way too late. The tragedy just took place. So you wasted effort, you wasted resources, you wasted human life, you wasted the happiness and the well-being of many individuals in your region, in your city, or in your country. So there are four aspects that imply that our measurement tends to be very bad, especially on social and in labor aspects. They are particularly bad in this sense. So one is we tend to measure in very infrequent ways. So we measure, when lucky, we measure once a year. Now, very difficult to make decisions when you measure only once a year. What happens is mostly that you have regret. Truly, that's more or less what happened when I go to the doctor. I am almost 60 years old, and every time I go to the doctor, she tells me that, Roberto, you are 1 year older. I say, like, yeah, I could have actually guessed that because I came last year. You have less hair, and yes, you can see, Robin and I go to the same barber. And then she tells me that I have gained about half a pound. So, it is a horrible experience. I don't know you, but that doesn't sound like I'm going to be able to make a good decision. And so, I have regret for 3 weeks. I behave properly for 3 weeks. And after that, I continue eating my pasta. I'm an Italian origin. I cannot stop eating pasta. So one of the aspects that happen is that we are measuring very infrequently. The second one is that we measure only these extreme events. So instead of measuring how do you treat women in an organization, we only measure when the women are so upset that they either complain or file a complaint in a labor court, or they quit. So again, we are not paying attention to the process of deterioration. The same with the environment. We're not paying attention to the process of deterioration. We wait until we lose a leg. Third aspect that is very important here is that we base a lot of our measurement on what the news outlet say. And a news outlet have a very short life to pay attention. Very, very short life. And let me just talk about the case of sexual harassment in the United States. If you go back to the last 10 years, you will realize that about 9 years ago, 9 years ago, almost all the sexual harassment cases that appear on the news in the United States were in the military. Then from the military, they moved to 2 years later to colleges and universities. Then about 3 years later, they moved to Hollywood. And I would say that since 2019 to today, there's no cases. You don't see anything on the news about sexual harassment. So, there's only two options. One, we have solved the problem, and therefore there's treatment of women is great, or we're not paying attention. See, to solve the problems of, I actually think it's the second one. I hope that everybody agrees that it's the second one. It's just, we're just not paying attention. And the news outlet, I mean, it's very difficult to solve the problems of, for example, of discrimination, or the problems of treatment of individuals if you only pay attention for 6 months. I mean, very difficult. You need to have a measurement that is there for a long period of time, that is consistent. The last one is a technicality, but it's an important technicality. Is that we pay attention, we construct these statistics that are meaningful only within certain ranges. So for example, again, in the case of sexual harassment, let me just pick one and talk about that. or for example, let me just talk about drug consumption, just to change the topic. So, but cities for the opioid crisis in the United States, they measure the number of kids that enter emergency rooms or die. And it happens to be that that number is coming down. So, they feel very happy. And again, I feel very happy that the kids are not dying, that's for sure, of an overdose of opioids. But the reason why they're not dying is that we have a better treatment, not that we're doing a better job. So truly the statistic is not meaningful. So, the district attorney of Boston and New York come and tell me, well, there are less people dying. And I said, well, don't take credit for it. I mean, you actually have done nothing to stop that. And it's just that we have now a treatment that actually helps them. So truly, we pay a lot of attention to statistics and create a false sense of accomplishment. That makes us feel good. People call this greenwashing. And I think this is actually a lot of organizations do greenwashing in the sense they produce something and they target a statistic that makes them feel better, but they truly are not changing or improving the situation. So to me, it's very difficult, again, very difficult to make decisions when we're not measuring properly. And I hope that I have convinced you that we make many mistakes. Not all the measurements are bad on everything. That I want to clarify. There are some that are relatively good in certain dimensions and others that are weaker in other dimensions. But I certainly think that when I look at the word promise, the personal aspects, the relationships, and the last two letters, social, political, and environment, those we measure horribly. Everything that is in the middle of that word, we do a little bit better. So we measure economics much better. We measure organizations better, like turnover, for example. You will measure in almost, I'm pretty sure that you measure turnover. And the institutions, you also measure things like, respect for the law and respect for the rules of law, etc. So we do have in the middle of the word, we have invested as a society a lot of effort in the middle. We have disregarded the extremes. So it's not surprising to me that the world is on this massive amount of tension, truly. I mean, if you don't measure, it's hard to pay attention. So therefore, we are disregarding a lot of aspects that are happening in our countries and our societies. And we are only realizing that we're making a mistake when the people are just so upset that they start a demonstration. Mm-hmm. And again, we only pay attention for a little bit. So I want to give you a challenge, because the World Trade Center, you are actually at the center of world trade. so to truly all the industries and organizations are there. And I think that one of the aspects that we can help all of us and our societies is that these are conversations that we start within institutions and organizations and industries. So when we have an industry, a trade conference on textiles, for example, I think it's important to understand that there's a role that they can play in measuring themselves better, not everybody else. Like, what is the impact that you are producing to others? Can you measure that better? Can you be transparent on that? These are questions that are very important, and those discussions will take place in your establishment. Okay, it happens there, and actually having those conversations become open and honest. And it's important to be honest, to understand what are the negative consequences of what our actions are. Is the first step to start measuring better. Because when you recognize that you have a problem, then you will have a chance to do it. I would like to leave a lot of questions.
Yeah.
So Robin, yes.
Of course. Thank you, Roberto. Very inspiring. And I love it that you're challenging us. So we're going to do a brief poll here. It's very scientifically, you'd love this. Question one is, so please put also your questions in the Q&A box. So question one is for the poll. Do you have sufficiently access to reliable data in order to make important decisions? And the second question is, do measurement problems tend to lead individuals to make bad decisions? So let's see what comes out of that. So now, Roberto, I want to dig right into the challenge that you threw at us here, that we're at the center of world trade. So first of all, I think it's puzzling, the fact that we focus on measurement of regret and extreme behavior. And so how can we make I'm going to throw the challenge right back to you as a question. So how can we make the connection here to what we measure in international commerce and then make decisions on those measurements, especially given that the international trade infrastructure is visibly shaking on its foundations, if not broken, and it seems inadequate to deal with challenges, let alone making the system inclusive for everyone?
Yes. So fantastic question. And one of the problems that is that we have not decided. I think this is like equilibriums. You see, Robin, we are in a bad equilibrium where we are all competing internationally for lower cost, and in that form of competition, we are disregarding aspects that might be costly. So we are strategically deciding not to measure because we don't want necessarily to incur in the cost of doing it better. I think that the only alternative here is, by the way, we're going to move away from this equilibrium. There's two chances. I mean, two possibilities. One is regulators take over. Okay, I really don't like that alternative, and the reason is, I think that organizations, for example, I do think that Apple, for example, knows a little bit about the supply chain that they have, but they don't know 100% of it because it's too complex. So I can understand that Apple has a problem understanding exactly every element of their supply chain. But one thing that I know for sure is that a politician in Washington knows less. So if I'm going to have someone making a decision about the world supply chain, I don't want that to be a regulator that is an ignorant about the situation. That's why now, but the companies and the industries need to understand that if they don't propose better measures, somebody will come and actually force it. And it's a little bit of what is happening right now in Europe, where they are forcing disclosure of measurements. And again, these statistics are not entirely correct. These statistics are to make the regulators feel better. That should not be the objective of humankind. I mean, the objective should be that the welfare of the Europeans improve, and the whole world improves. How the politicians feel is completely inconsequential in that equation. Mm-hmm. But if we don't do something, we're going to end up in that equilibrium where the politicians are going to come. So my advice will be that leaders like Apple, for example, start forcing the supply chain to become to be transparent and to disclose what they do. So my advice will be pick 5 areas that are important for Apple. So if the environment is one, if labor standards will be a second one, I'm guessing, okay, but just pick 5. You don't need 64, just 5 aspects that matter. And then ask the suppliers that are direct to Apple to force that disclosure on the ones that is 2 degrees of separation, then 3 degrees of separation.
It's really fascinating because in a previous session here, we had someone talk about the notion also of the private sector, of companies being change makers, game changers in society, and in order to make better decisions. And we actually polled our audience, and it was a whopping 100% of people agreeing that companies should play a role in society. So I want to go a little further in what you just talked about in international commerce. So we're really talking about the fact that crises also come from measuring the wrong things. So we've been borrowing, we've been running deficits, we're printing all the paper in the world, and the world will buy it. So will we never have to pay our debt? So where's this going to lead?
Well, that's a second one, yes. So two things. So one is I do think that given COVID, excessive support was the good policy. Okay, so if I want to if I wanted to, in fact, actually, I have videos in my classes and they're actually public in YouTube. But in March of last year, when this was happening in the world, I remember saying, like, if I were a central banker or any policymaker right now, and if I want to make a mistake, I want to make a mistake of giving too much help, not too little. Because too little in a situation of uncertainty will be terribly devastating. So I was actually advocating for a lot of expenditures and a lot of printing. It's exactly what happened. And Robin, we're going to pay. We're certainly going to pay. We're going to pay in the form of higher taxes and higher inflation, for sure. And you can see now the central bankers are starting to talk about the fact that they are seeing inflation. So one of the things that I do is I measure inflation rate together with Alberto Cavallo. He's a professor at Harvard right now, but he was here at MIT when we were together. We measure daily inflation rate by looking at retail prices worldwide in the internet. And our inflation right now is about, if you look from December to today, it's about 6% in the United States. 6, that's humongous. And Germany is 4. And France is 4. So, like, now I understand, you have to understand that online prices tend to move much earlier and faster than the typical store. So you would expect more inflation there, but we're seeing numbers that are extremely, extremely high. So the central bankers are going to start talking more and more about that. And part of the form we're going to pay is so either we pay more taxes or we pay off with an inflation tax. So we're going to pay with taxes. Now, I think in this case, it was the right decision. Okay, Robin, I think that indeed, if I were in March last year and I knew what I knew at the time, that was the right decision. Yeah. I would have never guessed that we were going to create a vaccine in 6 months.
Yeah, I would agree that monetary expansion was necessary. But what I'm now intrigued about is what you say when you measure inflation. We're back to measuring. Is very interesting that you say that now that people are buying so much online, that the data points that you use for measuring price increases and inflation are almost real time versus in the past, how much of a delay was there, right? So
a month and a half, Robin.
A month and a half. It's interesting. So in your opinion, you see central banks loosening the ropes here, or do you think, because I hear you say that we are looking at an inflationary environment coming up, and so what firepower have central banks left to deal with this at this point?
I think that central banks, again, given what I know today, if I were in the central bank, I will let inflation rate of the developed nations to get to 4. I think we are going to go to 4% inflation. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, in COVID, there are many injustices that were made that we have not measured them correctly. For example, domestic violence. So I want you to imagine, and I want all the audience to imagine what happened in COVID. We have a family where it's likely to have domestic violence. And what we did was to force that family to be together 24 hours a day, and now in a situation of stress. Mm-hmm. So if there was domestic violence before, it has to have increased tremendously. But we were not able to measure, Robin, because you know how domestic violence is measured? By an interview that they do at home. But if we're in COVID, I cannot send the interviewer. So in fact, we have not sent the interviewer yet. We're in 2021. So we are not going to measure this. We are going to measure this by criminal records. And if you think that inflation rate is low because it's a month and a half, imagine going through the process of filing a complaint into a police officer that then they actually go to the district attorney and then they file and they process the individual. So it takes years. So we do know that there are many injustices that took place in COVID. Mm-hmm. For example, poor kids that were not able to go to school. So our kids, I mean, my kids are older, but I'm pretty sure that most of the people in the audience, our kids were able to continue studying. Okay, because we all have internet, we all have an iPad, they go to good schools. So in some sense, we were badly affected, but it was not terrible. I want you to imagine what happened in Peru, where 60% of the kids actually received 1 year no education whatsoever. So one good way to deal with this is to continue the support for a while, and that means that that the inflation rate, I think, will get to 4%, almost for certain.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. So maybe thank you so much, Roberto. Final question. I think you convinced us that measuring is not a boring topic. But again, what motivated you to come up with this?
So that is so interesting. It was in 2001. I wanted to understand. I mean, between 1998 and 2001, I don't know if your audience is too young, but between 98 and 2001, there was a massive increase in prices of oil, increased about 4 times. Also, all the commodities increased by 4 times. So, pick any commodity increased by 4 times. Food prices increased by 5 times, and real estate increased by 3 times. So it was like a time of massive boom in these 3 sectors. And in fact, in 2008, you remember, we measured incorrectly the bubble in real estate and we collapsed that. So that's correct. So, but that started by the way, between 98 and 2001, those 4 years, it was just incredibly high. So my question was to the Bureau of Labor Statistics of the United States, said, well, what is happening to the inflation rate on the different groups of the society? Because the poor in the United States, they consume housing 5 times or 3 times, food 5 times, and transportation 3 times. I said, they have to be dying. Said the inflation rate that the poor has to be is humongous, and they didn't have the data.
Very unequal situation, but it's interesting to hear where your passion comes from. So
that's how it started. I said this is unacceptable, so I have to do it.
Good. Well, let's see what our poll results are, and it's probably the most scientific poll that you've ever had. So question 1: do you have sufficient access to reliable data in order to make important decisions? I think it's an important question because we're here now thinking about, wait a minute, I make decisions every day. Do I actually have the information, reliable information? Only 15% says yes.
That's good.
23% says no, which means I do not have sufficient access to reliable data. And 60% roughly says sometimes. So which means that only 15% of people think that they actually have the data, the information, or they think they have the data, the information they need to make important decisions. And the second question was, do measurement problems tend to lead individuals to make bad decisions? I will let you guess.
100% said yes.
It's 88%.
Yes, 88.
And change. Think that measurement problems lead individuals to make bad decisions. So I think it's definitely a very important point for us to think about and to keep in mind. And I think you gave us a challenge and a task, and we're going to take that to heart. So Roberto, with this, thank you so much for an exciting conversation. It's contagious, and I realize I may be obsessed with measurement myself, so my team will really welcome that.
No, thank you for the invitation. It was a great pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Roberto.
Thank you.
So we will now move to the next session of today's program: selflessness, community, and building a better business. So again, please click the next button to go to the next session, and we'll see you back momentarily.